Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to what I hope will be a very lively and provocative panel. I'm Amy Cortese. I'm a journalist and the author of a book called Loca Vesting about the local investing and community capital movement that actually I wrote in the wake of the financial crisis when which is very relevant to this panel, right? When predatory lending and reckless practices by big banks devastated so many communities, and many of them are just getting back on their feet. So we'll talk a little bit about those forces. So gentrification is a loaded topic, and before we get started, I just want to get a sense of, from the audience, like your views on it. So is gentrification, does anyone think it can be a good thing? Don't be afraid to say yes, because it can be, right? Okay, a little hesitancy, but yeah, some people think so. And does anyone think it's a bad thing? Okay, a lot of bad. And what about a gray area? Yeah, okay. All right, well, we have a really, really great panel here, and I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves. I live in Brooklyn, which is a rapidly changing, some would say gentrifying neighborhood, and this is happening everywhere, right? Especially in the Bay Area, but all over the place. And it's really a problem. Rents are rising so quickly. People, longtime residents, families are being pushed out, but also small local businesses, artists and community groups, and it's really destroying the fabric of a lot of places. And oftentimes we get these kind of shiny, sterile, or like preciously hipster, kind of environments that take over. So when rents are rising so quickly that so many people cannot afford to own a home anymore, and when ownership is so important to social and economic stability, right, and the foundation of communities, this is an issue. So that's why we're, part of the reason why we're talking about all this. So I am going to have my very wonderful panel introduce themselves. Quickly, I'll just go through it. First, we have, starting down at the end, Rodney Foxworth with Invested Impact, and he's also a co-founder of Impact Hub Baltimore. Scott Sport with, sorry, you're on this side, Capital Impact, which is a CDFI that does a lot of work in affordable housing. And George Newberry, who I'm really excited about what he's been doing and the fact that now we can all kind of participate in this, and he'll tell us more about it. And finally, Eve Picker from a transformational real estate platform called Small Change in Pittsburgh has kindly agreed to join us. Conda Mason had a conflict, so she's on another panel at this moment. So let's start, if you don't mind, we'll start down there with you. Rodney, do you want to introduce yourself and
Absolutely.
tell us your story and a little bit about your work?
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rodney Foxworth. I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Invested Impact. We're a small but mighty team. We do a lot of work with philanthropic institutions, individuals, corporate partners, around developing strategies of inclusion for grant making and social investment activities. And so this is, as a point of background, we're based in Baltimore, Maryland, which is a city that I think has gotten a lot of attention over the past year, in particular, given the uprising that occurred last April. But Baltimore is not unique in the challenges that it faces, and the question of gentrification for Baltimore in particular is I think it's shaped differently because it's inevitable, likely. I think that we're poised in a position to ensure that we put in the right strategies and policies to ensure that the gentrification that we see in other places does not happen in Baltimore, right? So, what are the opportunities for us to actually ensure that Baltimoreans are accruing wealth and building ownership within the context of, an improving city, right, and improving communities. For additional context, Baltimore has, like many post-industrial cities, been losing population for a number of years. In the 80s in particular, but in the 1990s, really the black and middle and working class was the sort of central exodus for the city. And so since then, African American and middle class and working class individuals have actually been the residents that have been leaving the city. And so that's an interesting question for a community that is made up of 64% African Americans. And so I think it poses some interesting challenges and opportunities for Baltimore that we're really still trying to grapple with. And I do think there's some really great work happening across the country and in Baltimore to inform how we go about ensuring that those who are still in the city, that we're really equipping them with the opportunities, the skill sets, the tools to really be able to benefit from some of the changes that are occurring in the city.
I'm Scott Sporty. I live and work just over there in Oakland, but I want to talk to you about Detroit. And for about the last 6 years, we've had a pretty significant place-based initiative in the city. And we started at the time when no one was lending in Detroit, helping to unstick stuck transactions. Basically, any deal was okay. Well, I wouldn't say that, but transactions were focused on bringing people, residents, into Detroit. And Detroit's story is one where people are comparing it to Brooklyn in the same ways, but in this case, it's like 8 cute stores. It's not the whole sweeping block and block and block. And the redevelopment of Detroit is still very nascent, but it is coming very quickly. And as I've been going there monthly for the last 6 years, one of my markers of progress for Detroit is the limited amount of free parking available. The streets are blocked. There are parking meters up. They've created the functional government that's now actually ticketing cars. And that has really changed the circumstances in Detroit to really feel like there's more vibrancy, but it's still happening along a pretty similar and skinny corridor. Detroit is a city with a poverty rate of about 40%. We're trying to bring in people of different incomes, create some mixed income communities that create some more economic activity. And there's still a huge vacancy problem in the city. But in Midtown, where the greatest concentration of sort of hipsterdom is happening, we are mindful that rents have risen pretty quickly in a short period of time. And so we're doing what we can right now we've created a program that we're actually calling Stay Midtown, that's enabling low-income residents of that part of Detroit to stay in that community by choice. So it'll be either providing some rental subsidy or some other assistance so they can either stay in that building or move to another building, but we're waiting for the time when more really attractive stock is being built because the development is happening quickly and we want people to be able to remain in the community. It is still much too early to declare Detroit a success story, but we want to be mindful of what's happening in other cities and make sure that we're catching this and stopping it before it gets too late, because we want Detroit to be the city for those people who still want to stay there.
I know people who live in Detroit who go crazy when they see those New York Times stories, like comparing it to Brooklyn, because it's like, it's not the real Detroit, right? It's like that one, it's Corktown, and yeah, so.
Good afternoon, my name is George Newberry, and I'm the founder and CEO of American Homeowner Preservation. And what we do is we purchase pools of defaulted mortgages from banks, typically secured by homes in low and moderate income neighborhoods across the country. We buy these at big discounts, and then we work with the families. If they want to stay in the home, we can offer modifications that are typically transformative. Because we can buy these mortgages so cheap, we can drop their principal, drop their payments, and forgive a large part of any delinquency that they have. Baltimore, Detroit, 2 big markets for us, but this is across the country. From coast to coast, much of the country has recovered. There's been appreciation. Many suburban and higher income neighborhoods have seen appreciation in the last 3-4 years, but the poorest communities of our country have seen little or no appreciation. In fact, homes whose values home with values in every price category from $50,000 on up to over $1 million have seen appreciation in the last year. The only one in which price category in which the values are dropping is home values of $50,000 and under. And in fact, right now in those communities, 53% of families who own homes with values of less than $50,000 are underwater, and not just underwater by a little bit, underwater by more than 25%. And so these families in all likelihood will never see equity in their lifetimes with those mortgages. So when we can buy them, I mean, the good news is that someone may owe $100,000 on a mortgage secured by a home that is only worth $30,000, and we can buy that mortgage for probably $9,000, so 30% of the $30,000. And with that, we can offer transformative modifications. In some of these communities, especially in San Francisco, you're saying, where can you buy a home for $30,000? And I'll tell you, in Baltimore, we have homes $5,000 and $10,000 values. And these are homes that actually people can live in. Say Detroit, I mean, there are homes that are nice looking homes that are habitable, value $5,000, $7,000. So this is a huge problem because many a times those homes have loans of $100,000 or more that are the fallout from the housing crisis of 10 years ago. And so this is what we're trying to remedy. And in specific to this panel, many of these neighborhoods are unfortunately ripe for gentrification. And I suppose it could be fortunate or unfortunate, but when gentrification comes at the cost of displacement of families who have maybe been in those neighborhoods for years and decades and generations, and we think that the better course of action is to displace those families and bring in more affluent residents. In many cases, I see that as a problem, and it's not that it's the municipalities will argue that the tax base has gone up. Hey, there are these new wealthier residents, and now they can support these other businesses. But what happened to the businesses that were there helping the residents many years ago? Many times these were small businesses owned by people in the neighborhood, and those are closing and are long gone in many cases. And that's unfortunate. It's, you know, the wealth gap is widening, the income gap is widening, and until we acknowledge that and reckon with these neighborhoods and find out solutions that can power these neighborhoods, I think we have a big problem. One final point is we recently, to address Amy's comment, historically our company has been supported by accredited investors, which are the wealthiest 3 or 5% of the country. We're the only people who could participate in our investments, and that always seemed wrong, because not that we didn't appreciate the fact that the investors were participating, but it seemed like the rich helping the poor, and it didn't seem right. So the good news is that recently we were qualified by the Securities and Exchange Commission to offer a Regulation A+ offering, which actually allows investors, accredited and non-accredited, to participate. And we dropped the minimum investment to $100, so it is truly accessible to everybody, and now people in every community can help their neighbors.
You know what, I want to help explain what he does, because there's kind of a simple way to think about it. And, you know, not hedge funds really, private equity has been buying up all of the distressed properties in this country. And by the way, the US government has been willingly selling them to them. And I know Blackstone is a sponsor here, but Blackstone is the largest investor now, and the largest landlord in the US. They own, they've bought 46,000 homes, and private equity overall has invested $20 billion in buying up rental properties over these past few years since the financial crisis. And what do? Like minimal repair, jack up the price, and the statistic is like half of all renters pay 1/3 or more of their income in rent every year, and that, as we know, is sustainable. And a lot of that is, you know, they're paying way more than 30%. They're paying like 50% of their income in rent. So what George does is he's like he's an alternative to these private equity funds buying up these distressed properties. He's buying them up, but he's actually working with the homeowners to keep them in their homes. And even still, there's like some profit in that. You're not making a killing, you're making a living, right, as they say. And so now anyone can invest as little as $100 into this vehicle. Like, where would they do that on your website?
The only way we can accept a $100 investment is by doing it online. So we use our website's ahpfund.com, and investors can go on there and open an account. And then basically the process is you put in your information, it auto-populates the investment document, you electronically sign the document, and you authorize an ACH from your bank account. And now you have an account, and you've invested, and that money would be used for the next purchase of these mortgages. And just to be clear, we don't buy distressed properties, we buy distressed mortgages. And it's a common, there's significant common but significant distinction. We now own the mortgage, so we can go to that family and allow that family to stay as a homeowner. The unfortunate trend over the last several years is that many hedge funds and private equity groups have actually bought the properties or bought the mortgages with the intent to eventually foreclose and get the property and turn it into a rental. And it is sad, but in the majority of the low and moderate communities across the country, most residents are paying more than 50% of their income to rent. And that is not building any generational wealth. It's just sucking all the income from these poor, from the poorest neighborhoods of the country, and kind of Wall Street is sucking that up through a straw, and it all ends up on Wall Street.
Through a hose, I would say. Okay, Eve Picker from Small Change.
Okay, so my background is I'm an architect by training. I have an urban design degree, and fairly early on I moved to Pittsburgh unexpectedly, and really fell in love with the city. I love Rust Belt cities. Pittsburgh at the time was probably had completely bottomed out. It was a mess. I didn't really realize how bad it was. But if any of you know the history of Pittsburgh, it had a population of almost $700,000, and the city emptied out to almost 700,000 people, and it emptied out to around 310,000 or 315,000 now. Families are a little smaller, so that's not an exact correlation. But that has a huge, we are Detroit 30 years ago. It's the same story, different industry, okay? Had an enormous impact on the city. There are still today many neighborhoods that really probably should be abandoned because they have never gotten back on their feet. Lots of properties that have disappeared, lots of hillsides with visible foundations on them, lots of weedy lots that the city can't possibly keep up with maintaining. The difference between Pittsburgh and Detroit is that Pittsburgh has this amazing demographic with rolling hills, so many of these very blighted neighborhoods are hidden, whereas in Detroit is very flat and you see all the blight spread out in front of you. So Pittsburgh's topography, in a sense, has saved it. So when I went to Pittsburgh, I changed my career path and I started doing real estate projects in underserved neighborhoods. And I bought distressed properties, unlike distressed mortgages, and built a business using public-private financing models to rebuild these incredibly difficult projects in difficult neighborhoods, often buying buildings from the city at their behest. I really love doing this work. I feel very passionately that cities need to be great places for everyone. These are the places we inhabit, and neighborhoods and cities need to be fabulous. So that's the way I approach development. One of the neighborhoods I worked in almost 15 years ago now, on two very, very distressed properties, recently has started to gentrify very, very rapidly, much to my horror. And much to my surprise, it sort of reached a tipping point and changed very, very rapidly. So I sort of sit at the other side of the table, having, I don't want to say contributed to that, but sort of seeing the evolution of how changing buildings, I'm talking about buildings that had sat vacant for 30 years. So it's a difficult thing to deal with, right? Do you leave them vacant? Do you renovate them? But buildings that sat vacant for a long time now renovated and contributing to this revitalization of this place. More recently, I've launched a startup called Small Change, and what we do is we raise money for developers who need funds to rebuild transformational projects that make a change in cities, whether it's creating jobs or green projects or projects that just make streets better. Those are the sorts of projects we want to fund.
Great. So this really is such a complicated topic. So to your point about, vacant buildings, but once you do something with them, that starts the wheels of gentrification in progress. And Rodney, you co-founded the Impact Hub in Baltimore, and I was going to ask Conda this question, she's co-founder of the Impact Hub in Oakland. And, it's just a little ironic because did the Impact Hub there help contribute to the gentrification? And I know Conda recently was one of the people that has been displaced by the rising prices there. So what are your thoughts on that, and what's happened around your own Impact Hub, and how do you be a good force for the community without setting that other stuff in motion that is so disruptive to people that live there?
Absolutely. And so I think, while Oakland and Baltimore are very similar, there are some distinct differences also. And so the Impact Hub in Baltimore is an emerging community, or qualified, it's called an emerging community, Station North Arts District. And many of the anchor institutions, which are mainly universities, so Johns Hopkins University, MICA, Maryland Institute College of Arts, have been doing tremendous investment into that catchment for some time. And so the Impact Hub is actually co-located in a much larger redevelopment on North Avenue, which is the most central sort of point of Baltimore City, a few blocks away from the city's public school system headquarters. And so there's a lot of conversation and introspection around like the larger sort of investment that's been made from these anchor institutions and what the impetus is for the investment. And so it's a really complicating question because for Impact Hub, the whole motivation is actually being able to equip local leadership, entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs to be able to lead change in their communities while also operating within an investment strategy broadly that might not actually be specifically attached or committed to executing that strategy. So it's very complicated. I would say that our responsibility as Impact Hub, as a co-founder of Impact Hub, is to constantly be able to bring in those voices that are oftentimes rendered invisible and marginalized. I will say too, though, in terms of the context of Baltimore, and my background is economic and workforce development, particularly with low-income communities and working with individuals returning from prison, especially. And so, for me, like when we talk about gentrification, we can't really divorce, structural challenges, inequities that occur, right? And so, and all the other sort of systems that are at play. So, Baltimore being a majority African American city, much like Pittsburgh and Detroit, we've lost a tremendous amount of residents. We're now about 620,000 residents, and at height, I think about close to 1 million at some point. So we've lost a tremendous amount of residents over time. The current mayor a few years ago initiated a 10,000 Families campaign. And I was asked to sit on a committee that was really looking at how do you attract the African American middle and working class back into the city, because again, keep in mind that this has been the population that really, after you get past the 60s and 70s, that's really the population that is leaving the city. And in fact, Baltimore has effectively become younger, in terms of its African American population, has become younger and poorer as a result of that. And so the question posed was, how do we attract the African American and middle class back to the city without really being able to do anything in terms of systems change around education and violence. And so everyone wants to have good schools and safe environments. And so if you're not really tackling that question, it really does, what I've seen, and I believe to be the case, whether it's, well-intentioned anchor institutions and others, the strategy has been, how do we attract younger folks that don't have children, et cetera, and those typically have been, educated, white folks that are not from the city. And yet we haven't really tackled the question of how do we really enable and engender folks from Baltimore to stay and have an incentive to come back. Because if you're not tackling a question of violence that disproportionately impacts African Americans in Baltimore, it's really hard to make the case for folks to come back to the city. And so I think having that interdisciplinary approach, right? So we're looking at workforce, real estate, housing, economic development, education. I think that's fundamental in the mind shift of how we actually ensure that the gentrification that does occur actually benefits those who are already located.
Yeah, it mirrors so many discussions we've been having, right, over the past few days. Jorge, you actually had a very interesting kind of approach to this, and you didn't give tell everyone, like, brief version of your background, how you got started with the I forget the building, the Meadows building, but how you turned that into something very positive, and there was a workforce training component of that, and it touches on flashpoint issues like policing, and he did something really pretty amazing. So can you tell us about that?
Here's a story. Some of these comments, it's a classic problem across the country, and unfortunately the problem is viewed as young African American males, and that is, your comments as to violence and whatnot, but the problem is really economic. It's not young African American males. The problem is economic and jobs, and the real solution to everything you just said is jobs. And if you had jobs in Baltimore, you would attract back low income, high income, whatever. You're going to attract people if they have jobs. The problem is they are not jobs. And I don't know specifics about Baltimore, but that's my guess. And I imagine the unemployment rate is pretty high.
The unemployment rate in particular communities is as high as like 30–40%. And you're absolutely right. We've lost so many quality paying jobs over the years. Most recent estimate that I saw was 95,000 since 1969 in the city alone. And so that's an incredible part of that conversation is how do you actually retain those jobs? How do you get people ready for the new economy? Are there other solutions for creating employment in the city?
So it is the fact that, and especially now, unemployment rate, and then you go unemployment rate for young African American males, and that is, it's even worse. Yeah. And so the question is that the fault of the young African American male, or is that the fault of a broken system and a broken society that is not providing sufficient education and opportunities to these young African American males? That is the problem. So we purchased.
Well, I think we all agree on that. So let's just tell the story about your building.
Okay, sorry,
what
I get
you
a little
did.
passionate. Okay, so here's the story. So I purchased this property called Woodland Meadows. It was nicknamed Uzi Alley. It was one of the largest housing projects in the country. It was 1,100 units, and when I bought it, it had the highest crime rate in the city of Columbus, and it was fascinating dynamic because it's similar to the rest of the country. There were 12 armed security guards who patrolled this complex 24 hours a day. They were all white, and as you look closely, it seemed like they were actually creating a lot of the problems in the community. So what we did was we fired them all, and we replaced them with residents. We created an unarmed community patrol, which was made up of residents, and
you trained them, right?
We trained them. Well, actually, first we took. They were people who actually, over time, what we started. First we started with the community patrol. It actually worked, and so then we said, hey, the way to really turn this property around is with the millions of dollars that we were putting into renovations is to require every contractor to employ residents, which were typically young African American males, and offer them jobs. And we made this requirement, and the only requirement to getting a job was to attend a class. We called it the Teach class. You would attend on time for 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, you're guaranteed a job. And The first few classes, there were only a few people that showed up, but once people started hearing people were really getting jobs, and these weren't high-paying jobs, they were maybe making $10, $12 an hour, but there was a huge demand, and it really dispelled the reality is, given the opportunity, a lot of these residents would do the right thing, given the opportunity, which was lacking. So within 6-8 months, almost every job at that complex was filled by a resident. Crime rate plummeted, collections went up. All the money that was going into the project, instead of being taken out of the project and being driven to the suburbs and the pockets of workers, and nothing against those workers, but that money was now staying in the community. Collections went up. The pride was clearly showing in the community. It transformed the community, and it was a big success story. Challenge is, after 2 years, occupancy at all-time highs, collections at all-time highs, great project. In fact, there was some media attention, which resulted in a lot of the residents getting jobs, being offered jobs at other companies off the complex. So a true success story. Some of the businesses that were started are still in business today. The long story, and final story, is that the property was hit by an ice storm which devastated the property and actually ended up in my financial undoing, and I rebuilt myself through American Homeowner Preservation.
Great. Yeah, and you wrote a book about this, so great.
I wrote a book, so if you want to hear the really long story, it's called Burn Zones.
So I wanted to say, this should be an interactive session, right? We don't have the answers up here, and we're interested in teasing out solutions and good ideas. So if anyone has anything at any point that they would like to contribute, please, raise your hand, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So be thinking about that. Okay.
I have a question. In my community, the story from public officials seems to be that a lot of the homeless and disadvantaged individuals are drug addicted or mentally ill, and so they're not really capable of holding a job. And I haven't heard that discussed much here, and I wondered if any of you have experienced that in your initiatives.
I mean, it's clear that drugs are a challenge, and they particularly ravage any community they touch, but particularly concentrate in low and moderate income communities. Again, I think it's a byproduct of a broken system and the fact that there's not enough economic opportunities, and those drug addictions wouldn't be so easy to pull people into those traps if they had other opportunities. But the reality is it's there, and that does create challenges. And that's a whole nother set of problems. I think there's a lot of people who do not have drug addictions, do not have mental disabilities, and nevertheless, they still can't get jobs, and and it leaves them susceptible, whether they're homeowners or renters, it leaves them susceptible, those neighborhoods particularly susceptible to gentrification.
Yeah, I mean, so in Baltimore, I think there are estimates that 60,000 residents have some form of drug addiction, and Baltimore has been ravaged by, like many cities, but Baltimore in particular has been ravaged by the drug economy and sort of, the quote-unquote war on drugs, and how that's impacted the livelihoods of members of many communities throughout Baltimore. I think, so one of probably the best examples that I can point to in terms of what would be seen as a gentrification project of scale in Baltimore was several years ago, and is still underway, the revitalization of East Baltimore. In a community at the time known as Middle East, it's now been rebranded as Eager Park, and this is located within it's 88 acres within the catchment area of Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And so this community, Middle East, had been losing population since the 70s. Again, to your point, no jobs, quality jobs not there, education not there. Also, people that are engaged in drug activity and addicted and needing additional services that they were not getting in Middle East. One of the things that was to occur was a significant investment into unraveling that. As a part of this larger effort to revitalize the community. That did not happen. And so I think, oftentimes we have to take when these opportunities present themselves, to really dig more deeply into how do we invest in solving for or mitigating some of these challenges that are facing individuals, because they obviously don't go away until they're displaced. And that example is probably the most acute example of displacement in Baltimore, where there was significant investment. You're talking about $1 billion plus investment, 88 acres, where we're supposed to have small business incubators for residents, create jobs, policies to have local hiring, that would also look at, hey, if you've got a criminal background or you've faced issues with alcoholism or drug addiction, we'll still have an opportunity for you if you go through these processes. We'll create access to human services that did not materialize until about 8 years after the initial investment occurred. I worked for an organization that was specifically involved in developing, strengthening the local hiring agreements, and also ensuring that developers and general contractors were in fact hiring individuals from the community. But that was 8 years after. And so what we saw at that point was that people had already been displaced, and people that were suffering from drug addiction weren't getting the services additionally that were sort of promised. And so to me, that's a prime example of not taking advantage of sort of the opportunities that can be driven back to community to sort of address the issues that you're talking about.
So as a real estate developer, I've thought about this a lot, because I really hate to think of myself as someone who started the ball rolling on gentrification in this particular neighborhood. I don't much like what I'm seeing when I look on the street. I was hoping the neighborhood would stay diverse, and it just isn't. It's becoming expensive very, very quickly. So I think about this a lot, and I think that in the end, I do think it falls on the shoulders of a city administration, and I think ours has been pretty lax in thinking ahead. It's easy to say that in hindsight, but I think there's some things that administrations can do to ensure that people keep their homes and that they can remain in the communities that they grew up in. One of the things, which is probably really difficult to tackle, I'm really firmly convinced, is property taxes. I mean, when someone is on a fixed income and their property taxes continue to rise, that is going to drive them out of a neighborhood. And I know there are some states that have implemented property tax systems where you simply pay taxes based on what you paid for the house, as long as you stay there. Once it sells, if it's more expensive, then the next owner pays a higher rate. And I think that's really brilliant. I mean, in Pittsburgh, there is an entire industry around property tax reassessments. I mean, there are attorneys, there's an entire county department. I don't know how many people that have employed, so that people can go and contest their assessed value every year. All of that would go away. So I'm pretty convinced that could be one solution. Another way that it's been handled in cities like Boston for many years, I don't have too many details about this, but I know that they have a set-aside in large residential projects where developers are required to provide a proportion of the units as affordable units. And while that doesn't solve everything, at least it keeps some units on the market that are affordable, when they're permitted to come in and do a really big project. So, the whole, having been in the shoes of having buildings that literally I had to support out of my own pocket for 12 years, it's pretty hard to say to developers, you have to do more, you have to keep businesses in there that may not be able to pay the rent. That's a really difficult thing to solve, and I can't really begin to figure out how to solve that. You have an option between leaving buildings empty and in disrepair, or making them better, and then eventually the rents do go up.
Yeah, so many issues there, but on the issue of small business, local business, San Francisco actually has a really interesting law that was passed a year ago. I think it was a proposition that really kind of flew under the radar, but basically there's a registry of legacy businesses. So if you have been a small business in San Francisco for a certain amount of years, I don't know if it's 20 or 30, something like that, you get on this list, and then you qualify for lower rent, and the city actually makes that up to the landlord. So it's a way of keeping these long-time, often the very businesses that give a place its, personality and its quirkiness, right? So it's a way of keeping them in the area. And I know in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, like, all the small businesses are turning over because they're jacking up their rents to like ridiculous prices. And then in the meantime, while they're waiting for like the big, chain tenant that's going to pay them $10,000 a month to come in, it sits empty for like a year. So we have a lot of that going on. And I wanted to mention, I forget what the connection was, but I made it a few minutes ago. But there are solutions out there. So there's policy. I know what it was. Different. We also, in New York, we have a set aside for low-income units in any new development, but it doesn't work out. It's like a nice idea, but they end up having like a separate entrance so they don't disturb the wealthier tenants coming in. So it has to be good policy, not just a set aside. And the problem is the big developers, not the small ones, but the big developers have too much clout. I mean, it's a big money business. It's a branch of finance, and how do we combat that?
I suppose what I was trying to say, I think that a really good administration could set out some policy well in advance, realizing that it's eventually going to happen. And at least, I don't know if you can stop it, but you can change the way it happens.
Scott, you're quiet. Any thoughts?
Well, I would say exactly. I can use the example of Oakland, which for years never realized that all of a sudden it was going to catch up to them. And that's a city that has not had affordability requirements. And all of a sudden, rents have skyrocketed, and it's hard to get any kind of affordability in the city. And teachers and firefighters are having to move out to Concord and far distances and commute long ways. Detroit is tackling it similarly because, first of all, they didn't have a real functional city government for a long time, but they are right now considering that very possibility. And up until this point, virtually any project didn't have to have a community benefit agreement if they received city money. And there is, we hope, some real change on the way to require affordability on a unit basis, and also if they receive any city money, and community benefit agreements, because these developers are receiving quite a bit of tax abatement from the city for a long period of time. The projects just don't pencil without it, and at some point rents will get to the point where they can pencil, and developers might be able to avoid some of the affordability requirements because they don't need the kind of subsidy that they've had before. But until then, we'll try to take advantage of it.
Was there a question? Yeah.
So my family and I in the Bay Area were evicted from a relatively affluent neighborhood because we rented a single family home and the seller, decided to sell. So we moved into a more affordable neighborhood and were very quickly vandalized for gentrification. So we kind of felt as though we were stuck between two worlds. My question is, from the consumer or the renter or just the citizen looking for a community, right now we have 3 small children. We're looking at public schools. We're looking at neighborhoods that we can afford but have some promise in the future. What kinds of policies or what are the signs that we could look for to be sure that we're not contributing to the problem?
Who wants to take that?
I think
Actually,
come to Pittsburgh. No.
Just to be clear, what
What
happened
about Baltimore?
when you said after
We need-
vandalism? I missed a little bit. I couldn't quite hear when you said that you moved into a new area that was more affordable. What was the other part? What happened then?
Well, we just kind of felt like, because we're renting, so we still haven't found our community for the long term. So we just want to be more careful when choosing the next place to live, that it isn't somewhere where people are going to think that we are gentrifying, but also somewhere that's affordable for a young family.
I'm I mean, I can only tell you from my experience in Pittsburgh that certainly the areas near Main Street areas that have the potential to become something more are those that are changing really rapidly. So Pittsburgh's demographic was the second oldest in the country after the steel mill collapse. So, and it's only been in the last couple of years that there's been this young demographic moving in that's really made this very sudden change. And they gravitate towards sort of authentic main streets and places that they can live and walk to where they work and where they shop. So perhaps you're safer staying away from, further away from a Main Street area. I don't really know what it's like in your city, but those are definitely the places that I have seen change more rapidly. And also places where there's more room for commercial, just general office use. We have tenants like Google just gobbling up more and more space, and everyone wants to be next to them. Well, that's kind of a sign that rents are going to go up.
It's a really good question, though, because you have, as a citizen, to try to, right now, and you're in the Bay Area, correct? So it's acute here. The rents and the property values are so high, and there's really, I imagine to afford it, to become we buy mortgages in California, but not anywhere on the coast. There's no, it's gone. But we do end up buying mortgages, actually in Stockton, which I think is fairly close to here. We still get mortgages there. Sacramento, South Sacramento, places in the desert. And I'm not to say you have to move there, but there, my point is there are affordable areas. And I'll tell you, I grew up in California, in Southern California, and now I spend most of my time in the Midwest. And the difference between values and rents is just drastic. If you were to go from here to Kansas City, for instance, and Kansas City has a school system, in many cases, would have school systems that are very competitive, and you'd be paying a fraction of the housing costs. The question is, do the wages match up? But it is, I don't know if there's actually a really good answer to your problem, to your question, which is a problem, because this 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you shouldn't have had to ask that question. There should have been it should be apparent what the answer would be. Today, and especially looking at the Bay Area, there's such that if you're making a lot of money, you can afford a place. If you're not, and you're just making a normal, like you said, teachers, police officers, it's tough. You're having to travel a long way. And if you're even making a little bit less than that, there may not be a place for you. And that is tragic. And I think 20 years ago, you could say, I'll move a little bit of a ways away, and I'd find an affordable place with a decent school, a good school system, and all the public services that you want. But there may not be a good answer to your problem. And the answer may be, unfortunately, to just move to a different state or to a different region. And that's not a good answer, but that may be the only answer that I can think of.
Yeah, the Bay Area in particular, right, illustrates this, inequality and concentration of wealth in this country and in the world. And I personally am interested in, all the policy stuff is great and we need that, but I'm interested in innovative new solutions to that. And I spend a lot of time in the, kind of crowdfunding world or alternative finance. There's lots of innovation happening there. And I wanted to mention just a few of these things that are kind of interesting. And there were a couple startups that pitched, earlier today that are doing things in real estate and affordable housing. But to your point about, firefighters and teachers can't afford to work there. There's a startup here in the Bay Area called Landed, so Landed, and so they sort of community fund mortgages. So the typical scenario they're talking about is a teacher, beloved teacher, the community wants to keep the teacher, but teacher can't afford to live there and they're gonna have to move, or commute 3 hours a day. So the parents, or whoever the school community is, would help crowdfund the mortgage to subsidize the mortgage, and then they would get, as I understand it, they would get, they would share in the appreciation of the real estate, and then at some point that teacher would refinance or maybe move, I don't know, and then they would get their return from that. So that's one solution for a certain demographic, though. Like we've been talking about the Project Runway all week, and not everyone can crowdfund something like that. But there are a couple of other things, like in New York, and I'm a member of the New York Real Estate Investment Cooperative, and that was started by a group of artists who were sick and tired of being booted out of everywhere. And so the goal is for everyone to pool our money and buy properties and become the landlords to keep them in the hands of the community. And this is still a work in progress, but we've identified our first building and we will need financing, but there are organizations that lend to cooperatives. And in New York, because the starting point of the real estate prices are so high, our strategy is to buy from the city, like at a reduced rate. But this could work elsewhere where, there's places.
It's been done quite a few places.
Where especially where the rents are lower. And then the third thing I came across recently in the crowdfunding space is on Indiegogo. There was a woman, African-American woman from Cincinnati, raising money for something called Buy the Block. And so she wants to get people together, pool their money, and become real estate investors together. So there are a lot of, different ways people are coming at this, and it's encouraging to me, but it's still a pretty big issue and problem to tackle. So would love to hear any other solutions or thoughts. Okay, I don't have my glasses on, so.
So I just have a question, and it's in a decidedly non-creative solution, in contrast to what you just shared. So in California, in the news today, it's the highest poverty rate in the country, largely driven by housing. And then it's fueling this debate where most economists are like, rent control is bad because it suppresses demand. And then there's going to be all these ballot initiatives, which if you've seen your rent triple, you're like, rent control must be good because otherwise I'm going to get kicked out. And so I just wonder, from your guys' perspective or experience as someone who's lived in Oakland for 20 years, has seen this change, does not want people kicked out, understands business but really doesn't get rent control, like what role should that be playing in solving this and keeping people, or should there be more creative solutions like the small business one you just mentioned in San Francisco? Why couldn't you do that for people? Which is just you give them vouchers to create the difference as opposed to, So I really, it's a topic that I'm very confused about, and I would love any thoughts you have.
Well, it's huge and it's problematic, and one of the loopholes in rent control, as you probably know, is that single-family homes don't apply. So it's multifamily buildings of a certain size here in California or in the Bay Area. So there is nothing that prevents a single-family homeowner from taking advantage of the ability to profit from their sale and kicking out an existing tenant. The complicated solution is a land trust or some sort of third sector kind of ownership where there's a cap on the resale value of the property so people can actually own their home, own their unit, but not get a 200% profit, but maybe a 5 or 10% profit, and it remains affordable within certain income bands. And I think we need to be much more serious about solutions like that in places where it's just become so expensive so quickly. So I'm seeing the same thing. I live in Oakland. Neighborhoods that were so different are now all coffee and yoga, and we can't continue that way. It can't last.
I think it's actually like a suite of solutions. It's never one thing. It's just frustrating to see them always being deployed too late. Certainly in Pittsburgh, there's a nonprofit now putting together a land trust for an area in sort of right next to this area that's gentrified, where there's a lot of vacant land. And I think they're doing the right thing. I mean, their purpose is to ensure that it remains affordable, and it's a good thing. So, but it shouldn't be the only thing. And I just feel like, in many places we're sort of reacting to something that's already happened instead of, mindfully having a list of things we can do well in advance, and sort of just, ignoring and hoping it's never going to happen in our time, which is kind of everyone's MO, I think.
And maybe there isn't an answer to it. There is not an answer, which is unfortunate. Throughout, I mean, the last few years in this country, between Occupy Wall Street, and you had Occupy Oakland was very strong, between the Kaepernick, I'm probably saying his name wrong, between that, Black Lives Matter, there's the problems that you're mentioning are a contagion across this country, and many of it is simply this inequality that's growing and growing, and where does it end? And the insurgency, which is it comes and goes as the abuses get particularly powerful or particularly horrible. At one point you see, if you look back in history, there's been civilizations that at some point the masses, the people, overthrow the elite. And here it is. I mean, we have the elite, and it's a very powerful, tiny class of number of people in America. And I forget, it's a ridiculous number, but the 400 wealthiest billionaires in this country have more wealth than the entire African American population of this country, which is 41 million people. Now, that is a ridiculous statistic, and it's really kind of embarrassing to share it. But that is stuff like that. Eventually, people just say enough. Now, how that manifests itself, I don't know. It could be kneeling during the national anthem, but there's going to be different things that will actually need to realign our society, and it may not happen now. It may happen in a year. It may happen in 10 years. May never happen. But at some point, it becomes so oppressive to people that something has to change. And right now, it may feel comfortable, and everyone feels comfortable enough. But at some point, something has to change, and it's historic in history. It happens. So ideally, something happens for the betterment of the everyman.
Viva la revolution. So, yeah, I put my glasses on. Yes, back there.
Hi, my name is Caroline from Haven Connect. We're TurboTax for affordable housing, and I just wanted to throw out. I've heard about landlords coming together to push to make sure that galleries don't come in, because it turns out that that's like one of the first, indicators of gentrification, as a way to sort of like cushion yourself selling yoga shops and coffee, and so just sort of thinking about that as like a strategy to prevent the gentrification that you hear about.
That's sad, though, to ban art, but it is kind of true. It does, yeah. Anyone else?
So, when I think about gentrification, especially here in San Francisco, it's a very interesting thing. So I live in the Bay View, and in the Bay View you have a lot of warehouses, or a lot of open spaces that are just now being sort of built up. So people aren't getting displaced as they are like in the Mission and other places. And in my mind, gentrification is really an issue about access to capital, right? Because 2008 was a horrible time for African Americans. Literally, if you made it, you were given bad loans that you didn't know anything about. Because maybe no one in your family actually owned a home before. You didn't know that terms were any worse than your white neighbor, simply because. Years later, 45 attorneys general come back and say, hey, Wells Fargo and Bank of America, you did a bad thing. Yet these people, but you decimated the wealth that was created, so they now don't have access to capital. That's one thing. How do we actually address that issue of access to capital? But then secondly, in these neighborhoods, they've been ignored. So the young lady sort of said something that it was sort of hurts my heart, but she's targeted, because people were frustrated. Not only frustrated that they were pushed out, but they're frustrated they've been ignored. Where were the cops when they needed it? Where were all these city services? And now all of a sudden, a few people move in and they get all the attention. So how do you address that piece of it too? So it's access to capital, but also just respecting the people who are there and not making this excuse around a greater tax base. Because remember, if these people actually went away, you didn't have anything, you couldn't actually give service to the people in Ventura Hill or Pacific Heights. I mean, they do actually give you money for you to do something. So how do you address that?
That's a huge challenge. the challenge is that often those public services follow gentrification, so they follow the affluent people that move into these areas. And why weren't they there before? And why does it require typically white affluent residents to move into a neighborhood to get the public services and the attention, as you put it, that's needed? And that's there's no answer to that. The other part, capital is ultra cheap right now. It's unbelievably cheap for the wealthy. The wealthy can borrow money at low to mid single digits. And yet, if you have credit dings or whatnot, or you're in a low and moderate income neighborhood, you're plagued by Wall Street's financial products such as payday loans, or small businesses get merchant cash advances. These things carry rates of 20, 25, 30% or more, and yet people are getting them because they're told, hey, you need something to get through yourself to payday or to make payroll, whatever it is. And they just, again, it's just Wall Street siphoning off the money out of these neighborhoods. And if someone has a greater credit risk, and so someone with a great credit score gets 5%, and someone with a little bit higher risk gets 7%, okay, that seems reasonable. But to go from 5 to 20, that doesn't make any sense. And the reality is, for homes, you go from 5 to 0, because if someone with bad credit right now, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get a home loan.
Now think about
Well,
that in terms of
I just want to say
neighborhoods.
we're over time, but brief comments, but we're a little beyond our time.
So I just want to say, in terms of neighborhood, it's exactly the same story. You want to borrow money to build something decent in a distressed neighborhood, there's no bank that will build it for you, which is why I have small change. So it's more than people, it's everything.
And actually, the great thing about small change and other crowdfunding platforms like that is they let the people who live in that neighborhood, in that area, actually invest in the real estate. So it is, part of it is ownership, right? And it's, you want to create wealth for the people that live there, and not just have it all go to the big developer or to the big bank.
So I'll just be really quick. I think, so those are all wonderful and necessary technical solutions, but one of the things I heard you ask is, how do you reframe how policy and institutions look at people? And I think it goes back to your point about, African American males, which obviously for me is very personal, about like how African American males, particularly in places like Detroit, Baltimore, other communities, are seen as like threats, right? And opposite of that is, young white individuals, educated, are assets. And so I think part of it is like, how do we really reframe the policies and institutions that govern how we invest in people and where we prioritize. So for example, in Baltimore City, we spend so much, nearly $500 million a year on the police department, which is absurd. But we don't have the kind of investment in education. We don't have the investment in small business development, economic development, affordable housing. So that to me is a decision that's made by institution. And how do we reframe it to say, the folks in this community, 64% African American, how do we build assets in partnership with them versus how do we sort of be punitive?
All right, well, I think that is a wrap. So thank you for coming, everyone. And thanks to our great panel.